Hey everybody, so I wanted to jump into the seventh section of the course, which is going to be on race and ethnicity, which is going to be our second section on inequality after we just finished social class. So to dig in order, first thing in this section you need to work on is make sure you know the difference between race and ethnicity. Race being some way the individuals are categorized based on similar or shared physical characteristic or biological traits. Now, ethnicity is going to be tied to cultural heritage, traditions, ancestries, language, beliefs, things that are non-biological but do provide a sense of identity for an ethnic group. Now, it's really important, you're going to do plenty of reading on this in the lecture notes and the textbook, but it's really important that you recognize that race, the social construction of race, because we don't normally talk about it as a social construction. We talk about race all the time. But one way to understand the social construction of race is going to be through your activity where you actually look through the census and look how the US Census each 10 years defines race either slightly or largely differently. That because race reflects whatever a society considers important at a given point in time to categorize individuals along these shared physical traits. So, for example, in 40 years from now, if society really cared about differences in eye color, they could establish racial categories based upon eye color because it is a social construction. So it's going to vary across societies, across time, across context. Now, within the U.S., we have a lot of examples of the social construction of race. One you hopefully are familiar about, and that's going to be how the changing definition of white in America. So, for example, in the early to mid 1900s, for a long time, Italian Americans were not classified as white. So benefits that were only available to white Americans were not available to Italian Americans. And Italian Americans fought hard to be classified as white because they wanted access to all the resources that white Americans had access to. And thus the social construction of white changed, and now Italian Americans are included. And they're not the only Americans of European ancestry that were once not defined as white that are now defined as white. So just as you work through this, recognize that race is a social construction. Despite it driving nearly everything in our society, it is, at the end of the day, socially constructed. Okay, so these terms are all important. I'm not going to read through them because you're going to read through them on your own. But the big takeaway I want you to recognize, one, is know how to use these terms correctly, because often we, use stereotype and prejudice interchangeably, and they're two terms that mean very different things. They obviously are tied together, but make sure you use these correctly. Now, with racism, we're going to talk a lot about racism, but I want you to be, by the end of this section, a lot better than you started around differentiating between personal and institutional racism. And when we talk about racism, of course, it's defined as the belief that humans can be divided along categories according to their biology, and then the idea that there can be some hierarchy where some groups are superior than others. So that's what produces racism. Now, personal racism is one we talk about most often. For example, when you think of racism, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is an individual that is acting racist toward another individual because of their race. And this can be things that are blatant, like using derogatory names, saying racial slurs. These are examples of personal racism at work. Now, personal racism is, of course, dangerous in a lot of ways. However, it is not the only form of racism, even on the personal level, because there's also a lot of subtle personal racism that happens that drives a lot of later life outcomes. For example, it happens a lot in schools, where you'll have school officials that steer white children toward higher earning, or toward classes that are going to translate to higher earning degrees, toward college focused tracks, and they steer students of color away from these with some kind of racist belief that some races are superior than others academically. This is an example of subtle racism, but it's going to have large ramifications down the road, even though it's not as overt. And this is where you see how subtle racism can be, if not more dangerous than personal racism, because if somebody is blatantly, or in terms of blatant personal racism, because if somebody is blatantly racist, you're able to identify them, you're able, whether you shame them or punish them, but that person is clearly identifiable as a racist, and you can see how their behavior is damaging. This subtle behavior is harder to recognize its ramifications and harder to also identify and stop. For example, if you asked a teacher that may be steered a student of color toward a non-college track and a white student toward a college track, that's kind of subtle racist action. If the only steering was based upon race and not upon aptitude and ability, that's dangerous because one, you probably didn't realize that's why the steering was happening. And two, it's easily defendable by those who did it. They're going to say something like, "Oh, I wasn't being racist. I was, just using test scores or something else." However, it's really important that we identify both blatant and subtle personal racism and try to deconstruct it and prevent it from happening going forward. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the personal racism element and the overt racism because you know what it is, you've seen it. I want this section you to focus more on institutionalized racism, but I think it's really important that you also think about at the personal level implicit biases, especially now as we're having this larger cultural conversation around the future of policing. And in the future of policing models, you're hearing a lot of advocacy for implicit bias training. If you don't know what that is, implicit bias is some kind of prejudice that exists, but exists below the conscious level. So this idea that you act in a biased manner, and everybody has implicit bias. That's first. Let's go on and put that on the table. Everybody has implicit biases, so please don't pretend like, that this is just bad people having biases. Everybody has biases, and these biases form from, and we often have shared similar biases because a lot of our implicit biases actually come not from personal interactions, because the individuals we live around, the individuals we go to school with, the individuals we work with often look like us and are predominantly the same race as us. And so a lot of the biases that we formulate around groups of people are from things like we see in the media or from things we've heard in social interactions, but not actual personal interactions. But since we're all swimming in these same cultural waters, we're all being socialized in a way that's going to produce similar biases at the very least. Now, implicit biases are really dangerous, and policing is where you can see how dangerous it is. And that's why you're seeing this calls for reform around implicit bias training, because if you are a police officer, you have more power than others in society. You have the ability to use force against someone and it still be deemed as justifiable if you have followed all the policies and procedures that you've been trained under. So that one is a big power. You also have the power to take somebody's civil rights away. You have the power to arrest somebody and take that person to a jail facility, and that person, while incarcerated, loses their civil rights. And if you become part of the criminal justice system, it's very hard to break that for a whole host of reasons that if you want to learn more about, please take one of our criminology classes. Now, with this implicit bias, that if an officer has implicit bias and is not aware of an implicit bias or isn't capable of checking in on these biases and making sure they don't influence decisions, then you have situations like the stop and frisk situations in New York. In New York, police officers were allowed to stop and search New Yorkers if they thought that they were suspicious. The idea was if they stopped and searched New Yorkers that they thought suspicious, they could find illegal firearms, narcotics, other types of things that would preserve public safety before somebody actually used those things. Like, for example, use the firearm in some kind of interaction. Stop and frisk was problematic in a lot of ways. One way is where you really see implicit biases showing up, because Black New Yorkers were stopped at a far higher rate than white New Yorkers when stop and frisk was in place. However, the data showed that when police officers in New York stopped white and Black New Yorkers, the hit rate in terms of actually finding something illegal on the New Yorker was much higher for white New Yorkers than Black New Yorkers. So if you look at it from just a bang for your buck scenario and efficiency standpoint, then you are much more successful stopping and frisking white New Yorkers than Black New Yorkers. However, police officers in New York still stopped and searched Black New Yorkers at a much higher rate than white New Yorkers, despite this reality in the data. And eventually this practice was found unconstitutional in the Supreme Court. But what you saw was implicit biases showing up in actual practices. So if an individual has the implicit bias where they think that people of color are more likely to be suspicious and more likely to be doing something criminal, they are going to stop people of color at higher rates. And that is exactly what happened. And it was their implicit biases showing up in terms of their policing practice. And that's why you're seeing this as a major element of reform in this current national conversation around policing. And so make sure you have a good idea of that and why that's important, especially as we keep going forward and having these conversations. Now, what I also want to focus on is, I think, a really important and a myth we have to break through is, you probably have heard, for like, people, especially white Americans, do not like talking about race. I recommend frequently in the lecture notes this week a book called White Fragility, and essentially that book walks through, Robert DiAngelo walks through why white people are so uncomfortable talking about race and racism, and also the dangers of that, the inability to identify it, interrogate it, talk about it. And, for example, talking about before we move on from the personal racism piece, one thing that DiAngelo warns about is the way we explain, most, white Americans explain racism, is they explain racism as a bad person doing bad things, a person that is immoral, a moral failing. And so white Americans are terrified to be called racist, because that would essentially, by using that framework, say, oh, I have done something bad. I am a bad person. I have done something immoral. However, DiAngelo makes the argument that if we were not so fragile when talking about race and racism, we should be, one, open to hearing. If somebody says, hey, you've done something racist, the proper reaction should be, please tell me what I did so I can better understand it, and I could fix that behavior going forward. And that would be more productive. However, because we fear talking about racism so much, largely rooted in our incorrect understandings of what racism is and how it manifests itself, we rarely able go back and fix behavior because we're just terrified of even being called it in the first place, rather than having more of an open dialogue around what it looks like and how it manifests itself. Okay, so moving on then to start taking more of a structural look at this. You're going to hear a lot the argument, especially among people that don't want to talk about race and racism and discrimination, that, well, it's not really about race, it's about class. Class is what's determining different interactions with the criminal justice system. Class is what's determining different educational attainment. Class is what's dictating different later life outcomes, different health outcomes, environmental, outcomes, things of that nature. However, there's been a lot of good research that has found that's actually not the case, that race is a more powerful predictor of later life outcomes than class is. In fact, I've linked a New York Times article I want you to read that does some really good visuals to show exactly data that plays out, showing that, no matter social class, Black Americans often end up worse off than white Americans. And this is because we still have so much structural and institutionalized discrimination that is setting up barriers in front of people of color that white Americans do not face throughout their lives, and also still the reality that white Americans have more access to opportunities still today. But because we're not willing to have this conversation and to interrogate these elements of discrimination, to interrogate these structural issues and then dismantle them, these things perpetuate. And actually, on looking at some anecdotal examples of this too, to look at race being more powerful than class, is you've seen, plenty of incidents where very successful, highly achieving Black Americans have to deal with, discrimination, whether it be in shops because they're still treated as suspicious, especially if they're in a high status marker shop. There's also, a lot of successful Black Americans talk about how much more pressure they feel than their white counterparts, because they feel like, one, if they're the only person of color in the room, that the pressure's put on them to bring diversity to the group, to bring a unique perspective. And also, they often face a lot of discrimination in these high-achieving spaces. One, because they're probably often the first, if not one of the few people of color to break through into those spaces that were previously inaccessible. But also a lot of pressure that Black Americans will talk about when they're in these high-achieving circles, that they feel even more pressure to succeed, because if they do not succeed, then that is attributed to a failure of their race, which is something that white Americans do not feel. As a white American, I do not worry, well, if I don't get promoted, then that's going to reflect on all white Americans. People are going to, everybody in my circle is going to say, oh, look, he didn't do it because he's inferior, because he's white. It's something as a white American you do not have to worry about. But Black Americans talk about carrying that burden of not only succeeding for themselves, but also wanting to succeed for their race. And that is a unique barrier and unique burden they carry. Okay, I'm going to pick up with the second section of this in a minute, and we will finish off this section on race and ethnicity.